has also been negotiated by, on the one hand, the Commission, on the other hand, the Member States, because everything that has to see with criminal law is within the remit of the Member States. What it means for ratification by the European Parliament, well, it means that the ratification process will be suspended, but that's up to the European Parliament to decide. And for the Member States, I think you have to make a difference between signing the agreement and ratifying the agreement. Member States have in fact unanimously decided to sign the agreement. They have authorized the Commission to do so on behalf of the European Union. They have decided for themselves to sign the agreement. So normally they should sign the agreement. The ratification, that's within the hands of the respective national parliaments. And there again, I start from the assumption that the whole ratifying process will be suspended until there is an opinion by the European Court of Justice.
Merci, Monsieur le Commissaire, pour être venu ici dans la salle de presse, avoir répondu à des questions. Nous, entre-temps, poursuivons, merci, avec notre rendez-vous de midi. Donc, comme le dernier point du collège aujourd'hui concernait une rencontre entre le collège et le gouvernement chypriote. Dans ce contexte, je me permets d'attirer votre attention sur le VIP Corner qui aura lieu à 14h15 aujourd'hui entre le président Barroso et le président chypriote Christofias. Donc je vous invite, si vous voulez savoir les résultats des consultations qui concernent notamment la préparation de la présidence chypriote, de venir à ce point de presse. Permettez-moi aussi brièvement, avant de vous donner la parole, de parcourir les événements de presse que nous avons prévus pour vous pour demain. Donc, comme déjà mentionné, à 11h, dans cette même salle de presse, nous aurons l'occasion de donner le bienvenu de nouveau au vice-président Rennes, qui, cette fois-ci, vous présentera la décision sur les prévisions économiques intermédiaires. Donc, ceux qui suivent ces dossiers sont invités de venir ici demain à 11h. Donc, c'est tout de ma part. Maintenant, je vous passe la parole. Et voilà, une première question.
Oui, c'était une question faite au commissaire de Gucht, mais j'espère que vous avez une réponse aussi. Ça concerne la démarche de saisir la Cour de justice. Quelle en est la base et comment ça se fait dans la pratique?
Je conclus que cette question est plutôt de caractère procédural, c'est-à-dire qui envoie la lettre, qui fait quoi exactement. Donc, si ça est acceptable pour vous, on vous donnera des réponses en bilatéral pour justement éviter que des questions de caractère plutôt procédural prennent la place ici au rendez-vous de midi. En ce qui concerne les messages politiques que nous avons eu à vous passer, c'était le commissaire même qui les avait donnés. Donc, je me limiterai à que les répéter. Donc, on pourra donner cette suite de cette manière sur quelle est exactement la procédure à suivre maintenant, quelles sont les démarches, quelles sont les différentes étapes de la consultation.
Je m'excuse quand même. Ce n'est pas une question procédurale, c'est une question qui vise la procédure, mais le fond, on est hautement politique si la Commission décide de saisir la Cour elle-même.
Comme vous avez entendu, le commissaire de Gucht l'avait mentionné assez clairement que le collège aujourd'hui avait débattu cette question et avait donné le mandat au commissaire de Gucht de s'engager dans les consultations avec la Cour de la justice. Dans cette question. Notre question.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question for Isaac, two related questions for Isaac on airlines and emissions trading. A group of 29 nations meeting in Moscow has threatened to challenge the EU legislation on to include airlines and emissions trading at ICAO, and/or has threatened to instruct their airlines unilaterally to ignore the European Union legislation. First, can you say whether or not the European Union or the European Commission would treat an ICAO judgment in this matter as a court ruling and therefore respect whatever ICAO decided should it come to that? And secondly, what can the Commission do in terms of enforcing the legislation against airlines that don't submit by the end April deadline of 2013 the permits to cover their discharges? I know they can apply a penalty, but what beyond that can the Commission do to enforce the legislation? Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Let me give you an overall comment, general comment on this meeting in Moscow. Well, we have not yet received a full account of from the meeting. We have seen some media reports of possible countermeasures against the EU for being serious about tackling growing emissions. But unfortunately, our questions for Moscow meeting participants remain unanswered. What are your concrete and constructive alternatives for a global agreement at ICAO? But so let's be honest, what came out of this meeting? Well, for what we could have seen, nothing new and nothing concrete. What the world needs now is more concrete action to tackle climate change and not declarations of possible countermeasures. Let me keep saying that the EU is a constructive partner. We have been and will always be at the forefront of efforts at ICAO to agree global action. We encourage all countries to focus their efforts on injecting positive ideas and forward-looking solutions into an UN-led process and not selective parallel meetings. So the serious work, what is taking place, the serious work should continue at ICAO. This means that rather than asking us for the suspension of the only functioning system that exists to address aviation carbon emissions, these countries criticizing the EU should come forward with concrete and constructive proposals. They know what our position is. The EU will review its legislation the day there's an ambitious global agreement in force. And why is that? Because we will be covered by this agreement too. If they are serious about getting a global agreement on action, on climate action, then let's get it done. But pending this long-awaited global agreement, the EU will continue to deliver on its promises to reduce aviation emissions from flights using EU airports. On your two questions, first question, is the so-called Article 48 or 38 dispute article at ICAO? Of course, the EU will defend its legislation at ICAO. We don't believe that, well, we don't believe, no, we're completely sure, and we've been backed by the Court of Justice, that our legislation does not breach any principle of international law, including ICAO principles. So, of course, we're very confident that there is any dispute procedure at ICAO. We will present our arguments, and we're confident that the ICAO dispute procedure will side with us. That's the first question. And your second question was about the penalties. Sorry, yeah. What can we do to enforce that? Look, while political discussions will keep going, and they will be at different levels, let me read you what the directive says in terms of penalties. You know that by April 2013, airlines have to account for their emissions and surrender the corresponding number of pollution permits. If they fail to do so, they risk having a fine of €100 per non-surrender CO2 ton. And you said, how can we enforce that? Well, the directive says that if an airline persistently fails with its obligations, that means persistently breaches the law, then the directive says that in the event that an aircraft operator fails to comply with these requirements, and where other enforcement measures like the political discussions that I have told you, or the penalties, have failed to ensure compliance, the administering member state may request the Commission to decide on the imposition of an operating ban on the aircraft operator concerned. But let me be very clear, Jonathan, on this point. We hope that this very last resort will never need to be applied.
assez complet comme réponse. Est-ce qu'il y a une autre question pour Isaac? Oh, c'est sur un autre sujet. C'est pour moi. C'est pour Isaac, voilà.
Isaac, so in the meeting this morning in Moscow, the 29 nations signed up to a declaration to cancel or postpone the EU law. And among the measures that they discussed were the cancellation of bilateral air agreements and imposition of financial penalties on EU carriers that might land in their countries. Those would be very expensive scenarios for an industry that already says it's very tightly squeezed by the recession and operates on very thin margins. With that in mind, and also bearing in mind that the Russians have also threatened to cancel overflights over, again, more expense for EU carriers under that scenario, have any preparations been undertaken to deal with that scenario whereby EU carriers effectively face higher costs in the near or medium term because of this unresolved issue? Thanks.
Thanks, James. And as you correctly said, these are just scenarios, hypothetical scenarios of possible measures and announced measures. So let's face it, let's play it down. I have not seen any concrete proposal, any concrete measure against the EU. But in general terms, very broadly, let me say that the European Union, in the day when a country, but not a country, for example, that is taking place on this meeting, but any country which decides to introduce or enforce discriminatory measures that hurt EU companies, well, then in that case, the Commission will immediately assess the situation and might take appropriate actions provided for under the EU legislation and international legislation. But as I said, I think that we need to understand what these kind of hypothetical and announced measures are being all about.
Un bref follow-up, je pense qu'on donne des réponses assez complètes. Un bref follow-up, et après une autre question.
Yeah, it's just the briefest follow-up. When you're referring, Isaac, to assessing those countermeasures under EU legislation and international legislation, is that a reference to retaliatory, or assessing the effects on trade and whether those measures would violate, say, agreements under the WTO? Is that sort of what you were referring to there? Thanks.
No, James, we're not there yet. We're just getting some wires and media reports from these announced and these possible things, and as they keep being hypothetical and possible measures, we prefer not to give any particular comment and go into the details on what action the EU might take in due course, provided that any of these actions are enforced.
Merci. S'il te plaît.
Could you answer the first question, whether the Commission is ready to accept a decision of the ICAO litigation process? Yes, no, or we don't care?
I think it was very implied in the question, but yes.
D'autres questions pour Isaac? Ou c'est sur un autre sujet? Isaac, oui.
Hi, Poppy Bullock from MLEX. Just a quick question. Are there any planned future communications with Russia or these other countries at this meeting, or is there a formal discussion that's going to take place between EU and these countries regarding this meeting and what actually happened?
There are different forums, Poppy, for these EU bilateral, EU-Russia summits, EU-China summits, but not only at summit level, also at technical level. We have continued regular discussions with all these countries, but as I said before, we would very much encourage these countries to focus their efforts at ICAO. We would very much to see these countries coming out at ICAO, getting together at ICAO, and getting the global agreement that the world so badly needs.
Merci. Un follow-up?